go over some questions. Let me touch on a couple of points that I need to touch on. So, after August 9th, we knew the war was over after we dropped that bomb right in Arizona. And as Bob was kind of alluding to it in the preamble before the presentation, the Japanese finally surrendered 5-6 days later on the 14th. And then on September 2nd in Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri, they actually signed the official surrender document. People asked, should we go demonstrate this on some atoll in the Pacific and bring out an international committee to watch it? And I said no. Why? If we would have done that and it did not work, it would just spur on the resolve of the Japanese. And I further said, we need to drop this over a highly populated area so they can see the power of this device and that they should surrender. We actually sent them a letter after the Potsdam conference call, the Potsdam Declaration. We asked the Japanese to unconditionally surrender. 3 days later, they came back and denied that they would surrender. So we gave them opportunity. After the war, I wouldn't support that bomb, but of course they went on with developing it. And in 1949, I wrote many letters saying we should not continue down this path, but in 1951 I changed my mind. A lot of people thought I was equivocating. But in 49 we didn't have the technology to build good hydrogen bombs, but in 51 we did. It became clear that if you want to keep peace in the world, you have to be the forefront of this technology. I have no doubt that if Hitler would have had this bomb, he would have used it on Stalingrad, or he would have used it on the ghettos of Warsaw. He would have used this device to master the world. And so if you need to keep peace, you need to be stronger. Thank God, or we can thank our human intellect that we've never used this in wartime device. But if we let these conflicts around the world go critical, such that we get into a world struggle, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that the Third World War will be a nuclear war. And the Fourth World War, if there should be one, will be fought with sticks and stones. So I ask you again, how do we keep these conflicts from going critical? In 1924, there was a man down in Southern California started this organization at a YMCA whose motto is to make better communication a worldwide reality. His name is Dr. Ralph Schneider. He created an organization called Toastmasters International. And it's because of those type of organizations we're in a room like this where we can have discussions about this. In 1960, the Japanese asked me to come and speak. And a lot of my friends said, you shouldn't go. And he said, I must go. You can't build this thing and then go hide in a cave. We have to talk about this. When I landed in Tokyo, the reporter was there, and he said, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you feel bad today? I said, I don't feel any worse today than I did yesterday. I don't feel any worse than I did tomorrow. But we have to talk about this, and the Japanese people were most gracious. I'm going to give you guys a handout at the end. It talks about the timeline that I've gone over. It also talks about the resources that I've used to prepare for this, and also shows all the Nobel laureates that were involved there. But I'm reading Richard Rhodes' book. It talks about the making of the atomic bomb, and then there's another book that he wrote the introduction to, and I literally cried when I read these stories in those books. So any questions from anybody?
So when you look at the amount of energy, I apologize if this is...
Go ahead, any questions?
So if you look at the amount of energy that it takes to mine the uranium, to centrifuge it or gaseous purify it, if you look at the amount of electricity that went into the device, if you look at about how many people's cars were driven and the amount of gasoline and the trains and the planes and the automobiles, was it a positive win in energy? Do we actually make more energy out of a nuclear device than we put into it? Because it sure seems like the first few atomic bombs were incredibly expensive to manufacture.
Oh, it was $2 billion.
Compared to what we got out, one big boom.
Exactly, yeah. And do we have more of the material that actually made 4 bombs at that time, probably not, but I think 2 bombs was enough to show them. And that's where they had to purify uranium as well as polonium. But to answer your question, obviously, it is efficient to use nuclear energy, else they wouldn't be building nuclear power plants. You would get way more energy when you control it, when you control the heat. Here, it was so rudimentary, we didn't know what we were doing. You can now take a thumbnail-sized piece of fissionable core, you can bring down a skyscraper. Okay. So back then, you're absolutely right, the $2 billion, but the whole point of that weapon was we didn't want Hitler to develop it first, and we wanted to put an end to the war.
So your feeling is that the first atomic bomb?
Totally inefficient.
No,
Totally
no.
inefficient, yeah.
But I mean, as far as kilowatt hours put into it versus kilowatt hours we got, was it just a terrible battery? Or was it actually, were you making more energy than you put into it? Do you know?
Well, you're definitely making more energy, right? If you can wipe out an entire city of 76,000.
I don't know, if you run every power plant in Tennessee for 3 years,
Yeah.
that's a lot of energy. That's why I was asking the question, I just don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't think they thought in those terms back then, right? But to answer the fundamental question, it is efficient to use nuclear energy. The problem with nuclear energy, once you get in the game, you're in the game forever. So you have to do tests. Since Alamogordo, there's been 2,000 nuclear bombs exploded, 1,000 of those above land and 700 of those in the desert of New Mexico. There is waste, Yucca Mountain facility. You have to deal with this. But it does produce energy.
We know Roosevelt died 3 months or so before the bomb, right? To what extent was Roosevelt involved in, but of course by then they knew the Nazis were, out of the game.
Yeah.
So to what extent was Roosevelt involved in planning the end game for the war, or in the particularly with regard to the atomic bomb, and to what extent was that handed off to Truman, or was it really like Truman's thing?
No, Truman made the decision, but Roosevelt, he had put people in power. There was Vannevar Bush, who was really the head of the overall Manhattan Project. Leslie Gross was doing all the marshaling and the facilities of how the Army was involved, and Oppenheimer was the technical lead of all this. But Roosevelt basically, he relegated that to Henry Stinson, who was the Secretary of War at the time, and Vannevar Bush handed up to him. Arthur Connet was involved. When Leslie Groves went to pick someone to oversee the technology of it, there were 3 people in mind. The top one was Ernest Lawrence over at UC Berkeley. He had Stanley Ulam over in Chicago, and then he had Harold Urey over at Columbia. Columbia was one of the headquarters of the Manhattan Project, as well as the Pentagon, and that's probably where the name Manhattan came from there. But yeah, Roosevelt didn't know anything of this technology, and that brings up a good point. When we talk about this question of how do we control nuclear energy, we can't allow the politicians to make these decisions. They don't know enough about how this stuff works. So scientists have to become politicians because we know how this works. That's why I blurted out in Harry Truman's office that he didn't fully understand this, right? So yeah, to answer your question, he wasn't there, and Truman took over, but eventually, the president is the commander-in-chief, so that decision was relegated to the president. And, he was an egotist, so he likes to say that he was the guy that fired it off, so. Questions?
After managing this project successfully, you were rewarded with your securities clearance stripped
Right,
and your career destroyed.
right.
I understand that Werner von Braun said that if you had been in the UK, you would have been knighted and
Right.
said, this is what happened. Some people feel that Louis Strauss had a lot to do with this. You haven't mentioned him yet. How do you feel about Louis Strauss, and was he out to get you, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, there was, like I said, I didn't support Edward Teller. And so right after the war, they focused all their energy now on the hydrogen bomb. And because I wouldn't support it, because it was just a genocidal weapon, I would be consulted, I'd give advice, but I wouldn't actively work on it. And then when I got involved with the Atomic Energy Commissions and trying to limit the situation, I wouldn't support the bond. But, so there was opposition there, because they're thinking, you know, to be fair to Edward Teller, you have to understand where he came from. He was also a Hungarian Jew, and he remembers the concentration camps and remembers the gulags. And so these people did not want Hitler to get this bomb. And then after we developed it, now the rest of the world, the technology is out there. So they wanted to continue down the path of building this. And Strauss was very big in that. And there was a lot of people didn't like me because I wouldn't support it. Strauss and Teller were two.
Strauss was at least one time in charge of the atomic energy.
Exactly.
So he did then
Right.
go after you.
He did. And eventually in '51, after looking at, you know, the way the world was forming and how this technology was getting better, I changed my mind. And people thought I was equivocating over the issue, but, you know, we have to be a superpower to keep those. I mean, think about this. A few years ago, the biographer of Osama bin Laden, a man by the name of Bodansky, he was asked a question. After Russia fell, there were 7 to 11 nuclear suitcases that went missing. And we asked Bodansky, does Osama bin Laden have one of those? Would he get one if he could? He said yes. Would he use it if he could? He said yes. That's pretty powerful, right? Because he would there are some people like him that there is no boundary upon which they would not cross. And so it made sense back in my era that we had to develop this and be the power of the bombs. But by that time, my security clearance had been stripped. People already knew I was opposed to this nuclear weapon because the fate of humanity relied on this, right? And it didn't look good. So yeah, Robert.
What would happen to the Manhattan Project if there was no such person called Robert Oppenheimer?
That's a great question. Like I said, you know, he picked me. If he didn't pick me, someone else could have done this. But
Who would
later,
that person be?
you know, like I said, those 3 men, Lawrence, Stanley Ulam, or Harold Urey, those are the 3 guys that, all of them were Nobel laureates. And that was another factor that Leslie Groves had to battle. I did not have a Nobel Prize, and they figured, how can this man who doesn't have a Nobel Prize oversee all these great minds that do? What kind of contention would be there? And it turns out, after everybody that was at Los Alamos would write later in their memoirs or their diaries that being at Los Alamos was the single most exciting time of their life. It was like a utopian scientific commune where we collaborated and worked together for this one common cause. And people would later write that Dr. Oppenheimer was the one who brought the esprit de corps to keep all these egos in check when they were in the same room. So I was the one who helped keep everybody together and made sure that we could get on track. Many people said later also that had I lived a little bit longer, and a lot of my ideas that I had proposed, like the Born-Oppenheimer theorem, things like that, then I probably would have gotten the Nobel Prize. The work I did on gravitation and black holes, none of that was known back then. And so people thought that I probably would have gotten one. But I never had stuck to one promising project. What other questions? Charles?
Ask another one.
Yeah?
I understand that when you defended your thesis, that it was a rather interesting time and you were very impressive, but some of the professors were quite relieved when it was all over. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I was born in 1904. I received my PhD in 1926, 22 years of age. As I said, I graduated Harvard 3 years summa cum laude. I had an unpromising year at Cavendish, and I ended up getting my PhD in 2 more years. When I was presenting my thesis, they were blown away. I was talking concepts that they didn't quite understand, and the board that was reviewing me was afraid I was going to start asking them questions. So it was an interesting experience. I knew 7 languages. I read Baudelaire in French. I wrote Dante in Italian. I knew ancient Greek and read did homework. I told you I learned Dutch to go speak at the Netherlands. When I was at Berkeley, I wanted to master the Hindu sacred scripts, the Upanishads, the Vedas, and the Bhagavad Gita, so I learned Sanskrit. Spoke German and English.
You were so darn smart, why weren't you one of the first to figure out that cigarettes were gonna kill you?
That's a great question. Who knows that answer? Yes.
This question requires you to get out of character, but you've done a lot of research for this, and I was wondering for the rest of us, if you wanted to read up on Robert Oppenheimer, is there a particular
definitely.
reference you can recommend?
We'll get to that question in a second. So any more questions for Dr. Oppenheimer? Jackie?
Yeah, so you mentioned that your brother and sister-in-law are all communists and
Yes.
you're not. So what's your attitude about communism?
So like I said, I was very involved in many communist fronts. All the people I respected in my era were communists. You have to agree that capitalism, for all the gifts that it gives, is a very bad distribution system. It favors the few, ignores the many. As Karl Marx said, it tramples on the workers that generate the wealth of the nation. I was a communist, but not a Soviet. I didn't want to undermine the United States the way the Soviet did. But if we could do this benignly, sure. So, and if you think about it, Los Alamos, they loved the fact that it was like a social comedy. It was, everybody collaborated together. It was a beautiful place to be. For scientists, my wife hated every minute of it.
So, Dr. Oppenheimer, if you have a chance to talk with relatives of the victims,
Right.
what would you say?
Let's think about the time, what was going on. Hitler was doing what he was doing, these atrocities in Europe, millions of Jews being exterminated just because they were Jewish. The Japanese jumped into this war. They were going all out. There was a war raging. I didn't tell the Japanese to get into the war. We gave them an opportunity to surrender. This war had been going on for some since the late 30s. We got in the war in 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. It's not really a question to the Japanese people, it's really to the world at large. Can we keep this gene in a bottle? We've done it for 69 years and one day. Can we continue to do this? And the only way we're going to do this is through cooperation and dialogue. Do we see enough of the immense power of this device? Now we have devices that are 650 to 1,000 times more powerful. We have to not let the world go critical. And the Japanese people, like I said, they were very gracious to me when I showed up. And of course I feel bad. I felt bad what Hitler was doing. I felt bad that the Japanese were doing what they were doing. But all that's behind us now. What have we learned from this event? That's why I like it when District 4 decides to tell me to get out of my coffin and come back to the earthly plane so we can have these conversations. That's why I went to Japan, so we could have these conversations. Because we never want this to happen again. So I feel bad, but no more than I did yesterday, no more than I will tomorrow. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, don't feel bad. What would have happened to the whole program should the Japanese have surrendered before the bomb dropped?
Oh, they wouldn't have used it, right? But while Japan was still raising, think about this, the US government, the Army spent $2 billion on a device. You know these guys want to use it, right? Of course they wanted to use it on Nazi Germany. They wanted to use it on Hitler. Like I said, it was a dilemma for us. Did the Japanese pose a compelling enough issue to actually drop it? They remembered Pearl Harbor, 1941. That was usually when countries went to war, they announced their declaration of war against them. They never did that. But to be fair to the Japanese, Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered into what he called the Lend-Lease program. We were giving military warships to Great Britain, and to get them across the Atlantic, we would send military ships to be a convoy to protect them. They would be attacked. So in a sense, were we already not in the war? We were giving arms, we were giving battleships, we were giving planes. And the Japanese did this, the Germans did this. Germany knew the war was going to end when we developed the Mustang, and we could fly from Great Britain all the way to Germany and back. No plane can do that trip all in one journey. And as soon as the head of the Luftwaffe saw the Mustang plane come over, he knew the German war was over. They didn't stand a chance against that kind of air attack. So I can't answer what if would we have dropped the bomb? There was no reason to drop the bomb on anybody. We wouldn't have dropped the bomb on peaceful nations.
So would it have been Korea then? Would be the first?
Oh, with the Korean War?
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, hopefully, the animosity would have settled down by then, right? But if you look at all the wars of the 20th century, from World War I, World War II, Korean War, the Vietnam War, they are all related. The Korean War is a fallout from World War II, the spoils of the war, the French going in there. So, and they were our allies.
When you went to Japan, did you go to Peace Park in Hiroshima?
You know, my brain is a little foggy right now. I don't remember what I did in Japan. I remember I ate fish. Yes, Stephen.
So what are your thoughts about radical nations with nuclear power now, like North Korea and perhaps Iran?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm the person to ask, but think about what goes on. Judeo-Christian Islam, they're all related. They're all Abrahamic faiths. They all believe in the Old Testament, as it's called in Christianity. It's the canonical scriptures of Judaism, Torah. It's also the Quran. It's all the same stories up to Abraham, the Abrahamic faiths. After that, the 12 tribes of Israel, and you have the divergence. This book was written 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. And today those books still affect human nature today. People who are staunch believers of that scripture, they read something that says the giant must be slain, and they interpret the giant to be the U.S. They're going to come and do this. I don't know how you change it other than what I keep saying is having dialogue, having discourse, having tolerance to other nations. We don't have to agree with what each other says, but can we come to some kind of an agreement that we never use this? When I get out of character, I'll talk about that. Any other questions for Dr. Oppenheimer?
Just one second.
Yeah, right.
Mutually assured destruction.
Say that again?
Mutually assured destruction. So that saved us from using the big one. So what's your feeling on mutually assured destruction? We've got enough, they've got enough, nobody will use it.
Well, in your day, you had a movie called War Games. I think gave us that message, right? And who knows what's going to happen tomorrow in the world or the next day? Will all the oil dry up someday, and this is going to cause a problem before we actually develop batteries that can give us the energy we need? Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? The population of the world today is much larger than in my day. It's over 7 billion people. In 1980, it was 4.6. Back in the 50s, it was below 3 billion. Why do we have these conflicts in the world today? We have too many people on this planet. 86% of the people on this planet are starving today. It's not getting any better. These are the issues that I believe we should be working on. If we can put a bunch of eggheads at Los Alamos and develop this device in 2 years and 10 months, don't you think if we took all those eggheads of today and put them in a room that we could solve problems like world population, feeding the world, traffic issues, pollution, right? So who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Hopefully people have learned the lesson. But if the world struggles happen where multiple nations are going after each other, and you have people with a mindset saying, well, if I can't win, they're not going to win, push the button. It's going to be sad if World War III ever happens. Because then the cockroaches are going to repopulate this planet. Yes?
You mentioned these books that affected the emotions.
Oh,
I kind
those
of missed
affected-
that.
Well,
What
not,
was
not,
that?
not me, Robert. We'll get, should we go into the third phase now? We'll ask the presenter questions. Any more questions for Robert Oppenheimer? Okay. Now I'm Leanne D'Angelo, distinguished Toastmaster. hand out these
You
handouts.
got to take off your hat.
I'll still look like him. So, what a gloomy guy, right? I personally would have not have dropped the bomb on Japan. I would have not said, do that over a highly populated, that's not me. I believe, I'm a Jeffersonian at heart, I believe we can do this. And if we can create this country, 235 years ago, a country that was 55 demigods got together and went about the business of creating a new republic where the people get to create their own laws and abandon the monarchies of Europe, right? I believe we can do that. I believe we can have discourse. I wouldn't have ever said, go drop it on a human population. I would have gone for the atoll out in the Pacific with an international committee to watch this and people from Japan there as well.
Who nixed it?
No one nixed it. I made this recommendation and Leslie Groves agreed to it. And Secretary of War, I'm telling you, I don't know how much I was influenced by it, by Leslie Groves, right? But you know how the Army is. They're gonna spend $2 billion on something, they're gonna use it. The only way we would not have used it, as your earlier question had Japan fallen before that, before August 6th, we would not have used it. So.
And the world could be a little bit different, right?
So this is the great book to read if you want to read about the biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's actually a chapter here called Now We're All Sons of Bitches. It talks about Leslie Groves, it talks about his communist activities. His wife had been married 3 times. She was a communist as well. Her first husband died of some disease. Her second husband was a communist and died in the Spanish Civil War. Her third husband was a doctor. And Kitty saw Robert Oppenheimer at some party and they hit it off and they fell in love. And Robert Oppenheimer went to her husband and convinced him that it was in his best interest to divorce his wife, and she did. He divorced her and then they got married and actually got pregnant before they got married. Their first son, Peter, was born 7 months later. Their daughter was born, Tony, at Los Alamos. So Einstein had 2 wives, geeks, and count us out as we're not sexually prowess as well, right?
So Lee, what is your obsession with Dr. Oppenheimer?
That's a great question. So I also do Thomas Jefferson, which is a great guy. What do these people have in common? Well, they're both white guys. But they do something great in history, but they have this kind of character flaw. Robert Oppenheimer strangling his best friend, Francis Ferguson, his communist persuasions. How do you understand this fault line in people? My obsession with this is when I was in college and started to learn chemistry, and we started learning about the power inside the neutrons and the protons of an atom, splitting it, and no one ever talked about the Manhattan Project. I always wondered what really happened with the Manhattan Project. I always was interested in World War II. There's some parts of history that once you start learning them, they're a black hole. You just get sucked in. World War II is one, the Civil War is another one. And I love the Founding Fathers, how we created this republic during the Age of Enlightenment, and how the Age of Enlightenment is still going on for us, and how the eyes of the world are always on the U.S. So I like those characters. I do it to fill gaps in my education, learn something new, have conversations like this with people instead of sitting in front of the TV with a clicker. I think this is much more satisfying, and you guys are going to go home thinking about these stories, and they're not like what we learned as children, right? We go into school and we have to do the test at the end of the week, and we learn dates and places and people, but we don't know these personal stories. How many people knew that Robert Oppenheimer was a communist? How many people knew about a young blind girl that all of a sudden sees for a moment? A young Hispanic shepherd got blown off his cot when that bomb went up at Alamogordo. Right? None of these people knew anything about quantum physics. The stories behind the people writing letters, and how many people knew that Einstein wrote a letter to to FDR and Leo Szilard urging him on to do this, and Edward Teller just focused on the hydrogen bomb. The movie in your day, Dr. Strangelove, is based on Edward Teller. He just wanted that bomb so bad, right? So it's to understand these points in history and what we can learn from that. And another issue is take what we learned from the Manhattan Project and look at the technology today. The one that comes to my mind, and I'm a molecular biologist by formal education, is the genome. My heroes in the world is Francis Crick and James D. Watson. I love reading all about that. I know the DNA molecule like the back of my hand. I just love that whole story behind that. And I'll probably come and do Francis Crick at some point. He ended up being the one who headed the Genome Project. But you have all these molecular biology labs around the world doing this common effort of sequencing genes of the human. They were sequencing genes of all these different animals. Jurassic Park could become a reality. We could make dinosaurs. I know Jefferson would love this. Hey, come to Monticello, look at my mastodon herd in the back here, right? He would have loved that. But you know, Jeff Goldblum has the greatest line in Jurassic Park. He's the chaos theory guy. And you know, first they get to the park and it's like, are we ever going to see any dinosaurs here in this dinosaur tour? And then when he finally sees the dinosaurs, he says, have we earned the right to put humans and dinosaurs together? They were separated by 65 million years. Do we have the right to do this? And what's the ramifications of that? So my question to all of you is, what is the ramifications of us all doing this genome project and knowing everything? There was somebody, and I'm glad, well, I'll tell you what happened. One molecular biologist looked at all of the genomes, the sequencing of the DNA in the human genome, and he saw this one pattern that kept repeating itself like 86% of the time, so he went out and got a patent on that sequence of DNA. Most of the DNA is not genes, and there's a reason for that. When radiation hits it, and you hit a part that's not a gene, you haven't done any damage. But if you hit a gene, you will do damage. They're usually fatal. A mutation in a gene is usually fatal. We have a gene for hemoglobin, the protein that transports oxygen in our blood. If you mutate that gene, you no longer create the protein for hemoglobin. You would die, right? So this guy went and got this patent. I'm so glad that the Supreme Court eventually reversed that. What was going to happen is if any doctor ever wanted to do gene therapy on you, and that particular sequence was in your gene, you'd have to pay him a royalty. Now, how can you go get a patent on something that's prior art? My genome, I had this before you went and got that patent. My genome is my genome. You have no say what I do, right? So I'm so glad that there was some logic eventually that it reversed. So let's think about those type of technologies that are going on today. How can we get in front of that? How can we learn from the Manhattan Project and apply those lessons to today's technologies? Because it's going to change our world, right? We all thought that Al Gore's internet was going to be a fad, right? But no, it's here to stay. That's a question, Jackie.
Yes, I never read the biography of Dr. Oppenheimer, but I was reading a book called Outlier. It
Okay.
mentioned
Maxwell.
Dr. Oppenheimer. It said he was trying to poison his tutor back in college, but he got caught. But then he talked his way out of this. So in that book, they describe like people like him.
Right.
It has a high practical intelligence, which
Yeah.
means they know what to say, how to say it to the right people at the right moment.
Right.
So after reading this book, do you think he's this kind of person?
Oh yeah, definitely. He was a very smart man, right? And I know a lot of smart people today. To answer your question about the smoking, I meet people in my profession that are just incredibly brilliant, but they smoke. And it's like, I just don't get that dichotomy, but somehow they do it. I can't explain that. My mother smoked her entire life and killed her, right? So yeah, he was brilliant. He knew, like I said, he really listened to people when they talked to him. And people like that. How many people, when you're talking to them all of a sudden, sort of like their smartphone, or you're talking to your boss in his office and he's on his computer, instead of looking at you. I mean, Robert Oppenheimer would listen to people and he understood them and he would give questions back and they would have a dialogue, right? He was brilliant. He knew how, like I said, he was the esprit de corps that made the Manhattan Project work. Without him, they probably could have got someone else to technically lead it, but you know, he brought them together. Leslie Groves, General Leslie Groves wanted to have decentralized laboratories, you know, just like the Army thinks. These guys over here developed the detonation device, these guys over here developed the uranium purification, these guys figure out how to make it miniature enough so no one knows how to put it all together and build a bomb. But Dr. Robert Oppenheimer made the case that they all have to be together because science is collaborative and it requires discussion. You know, you want to go to someone else's lab and say, can I borrow a cup of your software, right? So I'm baking a cake over here. So it's collaborative and that was probably the one point that I stood up to Leslie Groves and he honored my decision on.
Was Einstein not involved in this?
He was involved, he wasn't at Los Alamos, but he was involved, he wrote the letter, he heavily worked with Leo Szilard, who was involved. Like you'll see on the handout, there's a lot of Nobel laureates that were either directly or indirectly involved.
Okay.
You know, it was his theories that at the end of the 19th century, Niels Bohr first started it, and it was brought into the limelight by Albert Einstein, this whole concept of quantum physics and quantum mechanics. It's a way that, you know, Newtonian mechanics explains the world that we live in, but when you get to the infinitesimally small, it doesn't work, and that's where quantum mechanics came in to explain how stuff worked at the subatomic and the atomic level, right? Einstein, in 1905, it was his banner year. He had the photoelectric effect. He delivered the general theory on relativity and the special theory on relativity. And in 1921, he won the Nobel Prize for his collective work that he had given. They couldn't just pick one for him. It was everything he had done. Any one of those would have garnered the Nobel Prize. So it was a collective award for him.
Somehow I had this memory of reading that Einstein was against something, didn't like this idea somehow. I'm surprised about the letter. I thought he was against.
So you can actually read the letter in this book here. This book here has real letters from people that were at Los Alamos on the Manhattan Project. You have Army personnel in here, you have scientists, you have family members who heard the stories from. But no, the letter is in here from Leo Szilard and Einstein to President Roosevelt. I mean, he was a Jew as well. He came out of Germany and he left when that whole fascism and that whole maniacal behavior of Nazism was taking place in Germany, right? No other nation could have built the bomb other than the U.S. The infrastructure that we have, the mighty Columbia River that powered Hanford, all these great scientists that came in here, the natural resources that we have in the United States and be able to have the Army spend that kind of money. No other country could have done it. Germany couldn't have built this bomb. They didn't have enough resources. You think about Hitler was doing, he himself probably had an ego greater than Napoleon Bonaparte as well. He's fighting Great Britain. He's fighting France. He's fighting the United States, three of the great powers in the world, and then he takes on the Soviet Union. He was on every front fighting, and eventually he didn't have enough resources to win that war. It would have gone on longer, possibly, but I mean, we eventually took him over. The invasions on France, we kicked him out of France, and then we just marched all the way to Germany. So yeah, Einstein was a German Jew, and just appalled everybody. So.
The atomic bomb was a huge lesson, but it occurs to me that the generation that actually was alive and remembers that time is quickly fading.
It is.
Have you, as a presenter, put yourself out to, I'm trying to think of a way for people of the coming generations to understand what really could happen without having been alive during that time.
Exactly.
Can you do anything about that? Have you thought about ways of bringing that to life on a larger scale?
Exactly. So, great question. A former president of San Mateo Storytellers, when I proposed this idea, asked me why I wanted to do this. Well, first of all, those ideas I told you before, right? I wanted to learn about these key points in history. I want to learn more about the Manhattan Project. I want to learn more about him. But what we're doing tonight, one of my mentors is Claes Jenkinson, and he does a lot of these. He does William Shirer, he does Thomas Jefferson, he does Francis Bacon, he does J. Robert Oppenheimer, he does Teddy Roosevelt, he does Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis, the Neil Armstrong of his era. He goes out, he was the neighbor of Thomas Jefferson, the plantations were together. Thomas Jefferson was between Meriwether Lewis's age and Meriwether Lewis's parents' age. Meriwether Lewis would go out into the mountains for weeks and then come back. He could live off the land. So when it came time to explore the West, Thomas Jefferson, in a single stroke of his pen, when he bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte, doubled the size of the United States. It's considered the largest land purchase in the history of humans. But what he did, he achieved his vision. He wanted to have a country that had sea borders on 2 different oceans. And then he sent Meriwether Lewis out to the west to find the other coast and to find where the rivers were, because we owned the rivers and we wanted to see which ones went up into Canada. And then they enlisted Clark to be from the army to help with this. But he comes back after 3 years. His whole job was to go out there, document the flora, the fauna, who he met, the Indians. He met Indians and they were, for the most part, peaceful. In those 3 years, only one small group of Indians didn't attack. But for the most part, he met all these different Indians, and they were impoverished people, starving. And he would talk with them. But anyways, he came back. He never wrote his volumes of tomes he was supposed to, and he committed suicide. How do you explain that? You know, another fault in the human character. So these are interesting people to understand. And the way we bring them back to life is, I wanted to teach our storytellers how to do a Chautauqua. And I encourage them to think of people that they want to do and come up here. And then we go into the school systems. And instead of doing that didactic method of this date, this place, this person is going to be on the test, we're going to talk about these human stories that are truly behind these historical figures and how their human lives actually helped that significant point in history. So I want every storyteller here to go home tonight and start thinking about who they're going to come up here and do. And to answer your question, we have more of these town halls, and we make them free. There's no one got charged here, and you come here, and when you hear the next one, you tell your friends, and the next time I come back, I hope there's twice as many people in this room. And then we go to the big auditorium at the college there, and there's 300 people, and we tell these stories about these key people in history that we can learn about in the lesson from. And then you go to schools and you call them up. I've done over 30 youth leaderships and speech crafts in my 22 years in Toastmasters. I go to schools and they invite me back. I go to elementary schools, I go to junior highs, I go to private junior high schools, I go into high schools. And I teach them. We can go in there and do the same thing, doing these type of methods. And I know you guys are going to go away from tonight remembering the Manhattan Project, because now you have stories. And our motto at the San Mateo Storytellers is this: if you have a point to make, wrap it in a story. And if you tell a story, it better have a point. Right? So you guys are going to go away now with stories to remember the Manhattan Project. If I stood up here and just told you dates, you'd walk out of this room and wouldn't remember one of them. Was it September 14th? Was it December 12th? I don't remember what happened on that date, but you put the story behind it, and it comes to life, and you give the chronology and the flow of what was happening. So, yes, question?
Related to what you just talked about, we're here try to help everyone to talk about stories. How can you stand there, sustain yourself, make this story come to life, and remember all this? Do you have to remember all the lines? Of course, you're a natural talker. You're a natural nerd too.
You'll have to ask Dr. Oppenheimer. I learned in my Toastmaster journey, I read somewhere that if you dehydrate, you get memory loss. I drink a lot of water. I drink a lot of distilled water. And at some point I realized in my Toastmaster journey that I could read 2 pages of Shakespeare. I could do his eulogy of Mark Antony's eulogy of Julius Caesar. I could read it over and over, and I'm seeing the story. And then when I stand before the audience, I just replay the story. I'm not trying to remember the words, I'm remembering the story. And when I first do it, I may not get all the words correctly, but then I'll read it again, and then by the 3rd time, I know it. And I did this 15 years ago, but today I can still do that. I don't know how I remember it, but I do. And I just start playing the story. Just like tonight, I didn't try to remember everything, I just had the transitions. I started with July 16, I went on to August 6th, August 9th. I talked about what happened to me after the war, and then I talked about my life, and then I talked about the Manhattan Project. And so there's just kind of a high level outline, but I remember the stories that I read. And I just see those stories in my head as I'm standing before you and I'm telling this story. I know the hour's getting late, but I do want to talk about two stories in here. In Hiroshima, I actually cried when I read two of the stories in here. And it's accounts about David bomb dropped in Hiroshima. There was a Japanese man sitting on some steps at a bank. So we all know the bank opens at 9 o'clock. The bomb was dropped at 8:15. The bomb was so powerful that the radiation came and his body blocked the radiation for a brief moment before his body was vaporized. Behind him on the wall of the bank, made of granite, you saw the outline of this person. He was vaporized, the only thing left was a shadow. There's a similar story of a man carrying some produce on a cart, and he was taking a step, and the radiation hit him. He blocked the radiation for a brief moment, he vaporized, and on the sidewalk is this man taking a step. And when I read that, I began to literally cry. There's other stories where people, you were lucky if you were in ground zero and you got vaporized. If you had to deal, people were walking like zombies because they couldn't put their arms down. Their skin was flaking off like really thin paper. It was like they had black crepe paper on there, but it was their skin. They were burnt over their entire body. Some women had on white dresses with patterns. The white would reflect the radiation, but burned under their skin was the pattern of the dress. So if you think there's going to be a nuclear attack, put on some white clothing. But then there were the ones that died of the radiation. What a horrendous way to die. There were two deaths at Los Alamos, not before the first bombs were dropped. The first death was by a young 24-year-old Armenian American. He was working in one of the labs, and they were trying to figure out the critical mass. And this happened in December of 1945. And they had this technique called tickling the dragon. They would take this core of the uranium, and there was another core, and they would take like a pencil. This is how crude we were. We didn't know much about the radiation. Some wore gloves, some didn't, and they would tilt it such that it would get closer to the other half, and it would start to go critical, and they would take measurements. And one time he slipped, and it started to go critical. We saw the flash, and he dismantled it before it would go critical and blow up and take away, take a whole bunch of people. He was given a Medal of Honor for that. His name was Harry Daglin, but then he was later stripped of it because they said he wasn't following the procedure. So, and then the other one was Louis Slotin was the other one. And actually, Harry Daglin he had a core and he was putting these carbide bricks around, and as he put them, it would start to go critical. And he had a device that would start clicking if it started to go critical. So when he put the last brick on, it started to go critical, and as he pulled the brick off, he dropped it, and it went in. And that's what caused his. And then Louis Slotin was the one doing the tickling of the dragon with that hemisphere. And they both died. The first guy died 25 days later. Louis Slotin died 9 days later. He just started from radiation poisoning. I mean, you can imagine that your body starts shutting down, you start swelling up. Obviously, you're not going to eat anything. It was just a horrendous way to die. And when you read those stories, if you don't start to cry, you're probably not a human. And so I challenge everybody to read, the Manhattan Project, Making of the Atomic Bomb. It shows the device that told you the VW bug hanging. You can see the actual bomb. You can see the blast of Mike, which was the first hydrogen bomb that was 650 times stronger than the atom bomb. At this point, I think we'll call it an evening. Take cookies and water.